Good evening. So nice to have all of you here today. My name is Ron Hurst. I'm Chief Mission Officer for Colonial Williamsburg, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees, we're delighted to welcome you here to the Art Museums of Colonial Williamsburg. This inaugural for 2026 conference is the first of 5 that will take place, jointly sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, William and Mary, and the Omohundra Institute. And frankly, none of us can think of a better combination of organizations to be addressing a topic like this one as we move toward the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the creation of this nation and a number of other organizations and bodies. In a town like Williamsburg, to have 3 such powerhouse history organizations is truly remarkable, and I, for one, am glad for the renewal of these very important relationships. Now, this year's focus for the conference is Revolutionary Legacies, and we're very pleased to have you joining us, whether in person tonight or by live stream. Tonight's focus is the test of time, how we commemorate historical moments. Now, commemorating key moments in history is not necessarily a straightforward business. What is a celebration for some may generate unpleasant, in fact, difficult remembrances for others. So as we head toward the 2026 observations, we invite all of you to consider what ways we might use to commemorate these keystone events by looking at the past, understanding how it impacts the future, and knowing exactly where we are at the present moment. Now, after the presentation today, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers, and there will be microphones coming around, so raise your hand when you get ready to answer a question, and somebody will get a mic to you so that we can all hear. And finally, I am delighted to be introducing Barbara Hamm-Lee this evening as the moderator for this panel. Barbara is an award-winning journalist and broadcast host, and an expert in the fields of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. As the owner of Sharing Info, she works with organizations to maximize their media potential, market themselves effectively, and importantly, protect their brand. Now, Barbara is perhaps best known to many of us in the Hampton Roads area as the executive producer and the host of Another View, a weekly public radio program that explores issues from an African-American perspective. She's also created a series of town hall meetings called Race, Let's Talk About It, in response to the increasing tension that surrounds race relations in our nation today. Barbara is in fact, best person for leading this conversation this afternoon. I'm so happy that it was my idea to invite her. So without further ado, Barbara Hamm-Lee.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Ron. I appreciate that. So I'm going to get right into introducing our panel because they have lots to share with you. And as Ron said earlier, we will be taking questions from the audience. So jot down your question or remember what you would like to ask. And when you are ready to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll let you know when we're at that part in the program. But we need you to raise your hand and leave it up until we can get the microphone over to you. So let's start by introducing our panel. With a career spanning over 35 years, Christy S. Coleman has served as the Chief Executive Officer of some of the nation's most prominent museums. She is a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusion. Ms. Coleman is an innovator and leader in the museum field, having held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and the American Civil War Museum. She now serves as the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Ms. Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impact, including 3 honorary doctorates. In 2018, Time magazine named her one of 31 people changing the South. And in 2019, Worth magazine named her as one of 29 women changing the world. She's written numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, a public speaker, and has appeared on several national news and history programs, as well as a guest on Another View. She served as the historical consultant for the award-winning film Harriet and Showtime's Good Lord Bird. She most recently appeared in award-winning documentaries Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Black Patriots, Civil War Heroes, Neutral Ground, and When the Monuments Come Down. Please welcome Christy Coleman. Ed Ayers has been named National Professor of the Year, received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama at the White House, served as president of the Organization of American Historians, and won the Bancroft Prize for Distinguished Writing in American History. Professor Ayers served as the founding board chair of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond and has served on the boards of Colonial Williamsburg, the Fort Monroe Foundation, and the Valentine Museum. He is the executive director of New American History, an online project designed to help students and teachers to see the nation's history in new ways. He is a university professor and president emeritus at the University of Richmond. Please welcome Ed Ayers. And Tommy Norment first came to Virginia's 26th senatorial district as a child when his father worked at Cheatham Annex. A graduate of James Blair High School in Williamsburg, Senator Norment attended college at Virginia Military Institute before returning to Williamsburg to attend the Marshall Wythe School of Law at the College of William and Mary. In 1987, he was elected to the James City County Board of Supervisors. He served as chairman of the board in 1991 before being elected to the Senate of Virginia. During his 30 years in the Senate of Virginia, Tommy Norment has earned a reputation as one of the Commonwealth's most effective legislators. He served as Senate Republican leader, is a member of the Senate Judiciary, Finance and Appropriations, Rules, and Commerce and Labor Committees. Senator Norment maintains an active role in the community. He is a member of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's Board of Trustees and the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation's Board of Directors. He is on the Hampton Roads Board of Directors of Town Bank, and he chairs the Williamsburg Board of Town Bank. He is also a member of the Williamsburg Area Chamber of Commerce and the James City County Roriton Club. Professionally, he is an attorney with Kaufman and Knowles. Please welcome Senator Tommy Norment. So hello, panel.
Hello.
How are you?
Good.
So in order to help our audience truly understand what it is that we're talking about, I know each of you have been involved in many commemorations, but you've selected one that you want to particularly focus on. So Tommy, let's start with you. What would you like to focus on? Which commemoration, and how was it?
Well, for those that are blessed to not know me, I grew up in James City County and actually saw Her Majesty the Queen when she was here in 1957, and I was still in elementary school. And the reason I mentioned that is that the commemoration that stands out as most extraordinary in my mind was the 2007 commemoration when Her Majesty came and visited with us. And an awful lot of national and international attention was given to that commemoration because of her arrival. But what many people have forgotten, it was the first time in the history of America that a president attended two events in the same commemoration. And President Bush was generous enough to visit with us twice, and of course he did come when Her Majesty was here. As I reflect on it, there have been a lot of commemorations that have taken place here in Williamsburg, and I was talking with my friend Ron Hurst that one was back in 1983, if you can remember that. I was a mere child at the time. But the World International Summit Conference was here, and it received a lot of publicity that went both nationally and internationally. But the international exposure that 2007 commemoration had was extraordinary. And a lot of that came about, it was in planning for 10 years. And I had the pleasure, at times not so pleasurable for some who worked with me, but I had the pleasure of being the chairman of the management committee that ran the 2007 commemoration. And the reason I mentioned that it took 10 years to do is because an awful lot of preparatory work went into that commemoration that ultimately resulted in millions of impressions, I guess is what they call them in the digital world now. But we managed to place that commemoration on the front cover of Time magazine. We had many, many international visitors and international interviews that took place, so it really was an extraordinary event. And I think one of the few times that I've ever really gotten nervous in my life is when we were down at Jamestown, and I had the pleasure of presenting Her Majesty with the commemoration gift. And they handed me this script that was 3 pages long, and they said, Tommy, you've got 15 to 20 minutes to learn this script. And I said, wow, that's no problem. So I'm sitting in a chair by myself reading this, and they came and said, they have just changed the agenda, you have 2 minutes. And I was presenting it with a commemoration memorial that had been prepared from clay out of 3 very critical areas in Virginia's history. But each member of the UK had an imprint on it, and here I'm trying to figure out in 2 minutes, because a lot of it was written in Latin, and I barely speak English, so this was particularly challenging. But that's the one that sticks out in my mind.
Okay. Christy?
Well, the one that sticks out in my mind is the Civil War 150. But Ed's going to talk mostly about that. So I'll just say, being on the front end of another commemoration with the Virginia American Revolution 250 and the commission work there, and having the benefit of having the sort of the structural technical information to help inform the work that we're doing to be a bit more, because we don't have 10 years. We didn't have 10 years to pull this off.
How long did you have to pull it off?
Well, it's not here yet. But,
you're talking about for 2026.
Technically, for the
okay.
the 2026.
Okay.
I mean, we had a pandemic, and we had this and we had that. So we actually, there was some work that had begun before the pandemic among peer institutions talking about what they wanted to do, but the actual recognition by the Commonwealth of Virginia to get it done just came last year. So essentially, there's 5 years to make it happen. And so, but with that, there's already been some research on what are people's expectations regarding this as a whole. Not just coming to Virginia, but what they think about the 250th commemoration of around the Declaration of Independence and its meaning. And so we have some really interesting data sets about that. And we have a team, a staff now that has taken that work off of those of us who were, again, the institutional partners that were, volunteering a lot of time to try to get some of the initial ideas off the ground before a formal commission was established. And so I think where I am now, again, having the paper trail that's been left for us for from the 2007 to the 2019 commemorations here about the first legislative assembly and the arrival of the first Africans into British North America and the contracting for European white women to come here, all of that in 2019. It is, we have that, and again, that practical experience of sort of the emotional stuff that happened along with the academic stuff that happened through the Civil War 150. So I'll stop there and let him take that one up.
Yeah, hearing those stories, I'm a little jealous because what I'm talking about is how Richmond dealt with the sesquicentennial, I can almost say it, sesquicentennial of the Civil War, which I would say many people kind of dreaded. Being the former capital of the Confederacy, as the phrase has to be all said in one breath. There's a sense of what are we going to do? And when the United States had celebrated, and that's really the word, in 1960s, the centennial of the Civil War, it really was a mess. It was entirely segregated, imagined as a white brothers' war. Richmond built a center that looked like the Jetsons and had a Mercury space capsule outside. I'm not kidding.
Wow.
As well as dioramas, because it was all about the Cold War and about how, thank goodness, the United States came back together to be the awesome country that we are. Well, in 2011, you're not going to tell that story that way. How are you going to tell it? Now, the Commonwealth had a commission that had been planning on all this, but Richmond itself had so many talented people working on this. I was on the board of the American Civil War Center that Christy headed, and the Museum of the Confederacy, two different kinds of purposes and all of that, but people of goodwill, but how do you do this? But we ended up creating a coalition of 27 different organizations. We called it the Future of Richmond's Past. And we rebranded, if we can use the phrase, the commemoration from the outset. This is not a commemoration of the Civil War. This is a commemoration of the Civil War and emancipation. The most important thing that's happened in America is the end of the largest, most powerful system of slavery in the modern world. It's part of the same story. So how do you tell the story in ways that honors, remembers, is honest about everything? But we didn't start that until 2009. So the clock is running right out of the gate. So I would go around and talk to business groups and so forth and say, you may not care, but this is coming. And the New York Times and the Washington Post are going to come see how the former capital of the Confederacy confronted this defining event. I found that people across the political spectrum didn't really want to talk about it for different reasons. I remember talking to some young people, and it's like, let's talk about the food scene. Who cares about this history stuff? And it's like, but then on people who didn't want to stir things up, we had these nice monuments. This is what the Civil War was. There's nothing really to talk about. The South was fighting for its way of life. Let's don't be asking hard questions. Black people are like, we've seen this play before. And whenever has Virginia or Richmond really told the truth about this history? So a large part of this was persuading people that we could actually rise to the occasion, but you had to have a different answer for each group who were very skeptical about it. And so fortunately, the American Civil War Center already had Civil War Day. And so we decided that since we didn't have a place like Colonial Williamsburg, what even is the location of this, that we began to have Civil War and Emancipation Day every year. I was president of the University of Richmond at the time and said, hey, I've got a basketball arena. What do you say that we have the first event in the nation on this commemoration in 2009, and it will be, and they said, we'd like for it to be about the coming of the Civil War. And I said, well, it can't be that, because if they'd known it was coming, they wouldn't have had it. So actually what it was America on the eve of the Civil War. And we had 2,600 people from 27 states show up on a Thursday for a full day of talking. And they could see this is what it would look like to actually tell an integrated story in the same stage. We're not segregating out slavery or black people as a separate story. This is woven into the very fabric. And I just had older white people come up to me and say, Ed, I just never thought about it this way. I thought this was about what a fine man Robert E. Lee was or whatever. And so finding a language in which we could talk to all these constituencies and show goodwill, but honesty, the thing, we kind of had to do it over and over again. And one of the best days of my life was April 2015, when the governor gave us the Capitol Square to put up pop-up museums and to have the choir from Virginia Union and to have reenactors of the United States colored troops march up the same main street they'd marched up in 1865 to liberate Richmond. And Christy Coleman spoke from the steps of the Capitol, that had, of course, been the capital of the Confederacy. There was not a Confederate flag to be seen anywhere. And there's a video of this that you can see that is very powerful and shows that what this looks like. So that's April 2015. June is when the travesty in Charleston took place under the banner of the Confederate flag. And so we felt that we had made progress in the former capital of the Confederacy, that we'd done a better job of this than, frankly, anybody else in the United States. I think that's fair to say. And the night before that, in Shockoe Bottom, a commemoration of the celebration of freedom for people who'd never lived out of slavery to see it themselves. Very powerful. I just got chills thinking about it right now. And so that was sort of the embodiment of all this. So the theater of it, the music of it, but then the Commonwealth, the governor acknowledging Virginia's role in all this. So there was a lot of improvisation, start to finish, but trying to demonstrate that Virginia and Richmond could talk about the hardest things in American history with honesty and include everybody. And the outcome of that was the American Civil War Museum that Christy chaired, and that exists today, and I think tells the story of the American Civil War better than anywhere else in the world. So sort of an outcome out of all that. But it was, I'm going to use a phrase that historians hate. It was a simpler time in 2009 because of all the things that haven't happened that Christy and I are, of course, aware of all of these currents and things. But it was news to people in some ways that you would try to do this. Now we have no choice. It's our opportunity, our obligation to tell the story fully. So that's what I remember.
Well, actually, that leads right into my first question for you all, because I had the pleasure of serving on the 2019 American Evolution commemoration. And one of the biggest hurdles to overcome was whose story are we going to tell? And there was a lot of back and forth, and as Christy said a little earlier, so it wound up being 5 different stories in essence, which was the first representative legislative assembly in Virginia, the arrival of the first Africans to English North America, women in early Virginia, Thanksgiving in Virginia, which covered Native Americans, and entrepreneurialism and economic innovation in Virginia. But it was a big deal to get to those 5 stories. How do you begin to tell the history, and whose history are you telling when things like this happen?
Well, I think that's the inherent flaw, right, in the way people think about the past, is that it is your story and your story and your story, and that is the mistake. The mistake is all of this belongs to every single one of us. The question is, how are you choosing to pivot at a given point so that you can understand and see and digest an element of that past that you may not have understood before? And for me, that's one of the things that I find just extraordinary, is that we have this. So let me be clear: it's all of our stories, but voice is important. So I do need to add that element. That voice is important. And the perfect example of that is, for example, the simplest one, since we're talking, and I know this was 1607, but, John Smith talking about what happened, that that Powhatan, they try to kill him and Pocahontas saves him. That's sort of our mythology about what happened at Jamestown. Well, from the indigenous perspective, that's not what, they weren't going to kill him. They were trying to make him bow down and recognize the sovereignty and the power of Powhatan. Right? I mean, so it was a very different point of view. And if you don't know that, you can continue these sort of fantasies about
continue the
what's
mythology
going on, right?
as opposed to the
And
truth.
so, and it also, I think as we are maturing and thinking about the American past, yes, we have the opportunity here in Virginia. We have the first permanent English settlement, and at one point we were telling ourselves where America began, and that's not accurate either, because, right? I mean, not even to mention, you know, the thousands of indigenous people, but the fact that the Dutch were already here and the Spanish were to the south of us and the, you know, the French were over here and people had been trading back and forth. And I think the Norse were here as well, right? There was some, you know, like hundreds of years before, you know, any of those folks showed up, because, you know, they used to just wander around in the ocean. And so, but my point is, America has been diverse from her beginning. The problem that we all have, and those of you who've heard me say this before, please forgive this, because this is a part of my mantra now. We've got to get away from this idea of, we've got to understand the distinctions between history, which is the forensic, heritage is what we create for cohesion, and memory. We've got to recognize that each of those are very distinct things. And what we are striving to do is to help people understand the forensic and the process, the actual detective work and understanding our shared past, which evolves by the questions that we ask. Because in the, you know, to paraphrase, history's never been for the dead. It's always been about us, how we choose to connect. And so we keep going back to that forensic for new information. And what I hope is our public history side is going to help create new memories and experiences so people choose to infuse that heritage making with actual forensic history. Until we get to that, we keep having this push and pull, you know, of people who are saying, you know, you're just trying to destroy my history. Nobody's destroying anything. What we're talking about is, for a long time, you just haven't gotten a full picture, right? It's like if somebody just asked me, Christy Coleman, what happened on 9/11? And I can tell you exactly what my experience was, where I was, because I was in New York on September 10th. Had been there 3 days. I can tell you my experience. For me to write a history and then tell everybody that that is what happened on 9/11 would be patently wrong and false. And yet, we've done that with every element of the American story by only focusing on a dominant group, whether that dominance was through might or by sheer numbers. And that's inaccurate. That's not giving us the depth that we require. But I know I'm speaking to the choir, since the majority of you are academics and public history people. But that's the thing. I mean, I just...
Well, to carry it a step
I was interested in your observations about the 2019 commemoration, and I did have the distinctive pleasure of chairing both the 2007 and the 2019 commemoration. And some of the things that we dealt with, as I've listened to Ed and Christy talk about some of the tensions and the voices that were taking place, actually go back to 1957. When I assumed the position of the chairman of the management committee of the 2007 commemoration, I went back and started reading some of the history of what took place in 1957. And one of the most offensive occurrences that took place is that they had a state dinner and they disinvited the African Americans and the indigenous people to that dinner at the last moment. And I thought, this is absolutely horrendous. And we cannot perpetuate or embrace that 50 years later on. So one of the first challenges that the management committee dealt with was, I came up with this thought, really we're dealing with the indigenous or the Native Americans, we're dealing with the African Americans, and we're dealing with the English settlers. We need to empower each of those three groups to have the independence to decide autonomously how they are going to interpret their perspective of history as it related in 1619. Well, this was not embraced with enormous affection at the outset and took a little persuasion, but you know, I went to VMI, so I'm not very bright, but I'm very persistent, and was able to articulate an approach on that. And at first there was disbelief, particularly from the indigenous population. They had never been treated with that degree of respect. And they said, you're going to allow us to decide what our messaging and our voice is going to be in this commemoration? Absolutely, yes. And of course, then the African American population, they were very suspect of it. And we really did some extraordinary things. Some of you that were around then may remember that the State of the Black Union was presented here with
Yes.
Tavis Smiley.
Yes.
Well, even that created some issues because we had some invited guests. Cordell West was here, and some other wonderful academicians were on the stage. Well, our unexpected guest who was offended that he had not been invited to participate was a gentleman by the name of Jesse Jackson. And so here we thought everything had run so smoothly. We'd done all this preparatory work. We knew what the presentation was going to be on the State of the Black Union. And Reverend Jackson had a little different perspective. But those were some of the challenges that we dealt with in trying to give a dignified opportunity of each of the three cultures to have a resounding voice, but to be able to have the self-determination on what their messaging was going to be was exceptional. And I really think one of the most convincing arguments that I made was when I brought out the article from 1957 about how the indigenous people and the African Americans had been disinvited from the dinner with the Queen. And it was almost an embarrassment factor, if you will. 50 years had elapsed, but there were still some residual thoughts and feelings. And so what happened a lot in 2007 started in 1957, and then we were able to leverage that even more in the 2019 commemoration.
Ed, let me ask you a question too, along that line. One of the other things that I observed from 2019 was not a lot of mixing of the races or different types of folks, depending on what the activity was. How do we get people to not only focus on their part, and what happened with them, but also to go to someone else's part, if you will, or another part of the history, to be able, so that at some point we all have a fuller picture of what was going on in this country?
That's a great question. One advantage that the Civil War commemoration had that is not as clear here is chronology. People sort of know about the sequence of the Civil War, memorize the battles and this kind of things. You need to look for moments where in the history itself this interaction took place. And that rather than separate it at the beginning and trying to combine it, actually think about in the grain of the narrative. Where were moments where the indigenous people or black people and the people leading the colony were actually in conjunction? So in some ways that means you need to seek out points of conflict, right? And rather than, you have to commemorate, to remember, you're going to have to be honest and acknowledge things that are hard. That is often where those folks in history came together. So that's, I would say, work with the story that we actually know from this forensic history. If I could build on the comments of both my friends,
Sure.
If we think about asking people themselves what does their history mean, and thinking about what history is begins with questions, not answers. We've got to do that in the schools too. If before this, the lessons in the classroom are here, memorize these 5 names or dates, they're not going to be able to take advantage of the possibilities, the excitement of going to the actual places where things happen. We've got to build this inquiry-based learning into everything that we think about history. People should leave these moments that we're talking about now with more questions than they entered with. The conversation that we're having right now about how do you teach history in Virginia is foreclosing the opportunities to learn as much as we can from this complicated past. So there's a commonality, and also including classrooms and teachers from the beginning of what do you want your students to learn when they come here would be a great way to frame what we're going to be doing. So there's a commonality of purpose that and this is a long answer to your question, from the beginning, of course we're going to include everybody, but not include, we're going to show them making each other's history. Gotcha. And how would we know that? Well, we begin with looking at the evidence. What's at issue? Why did they think this way? That's much more compelling than coming and watch somebody telling you, this is what this was. Okay.
I nominate Ed Ayers to be the superintendent of public education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You get my nomination.
Thanks very much. I didn't know that position was open.
No, that was a thing. Thank you. So, Christy, what's the role of museums in all of this, since you're the queen of museums?
See, the wonderful thing about the museum is that it is all experiential, right? I mean, we have the stuff. You know, we may share the archives with the universities or the libraries, but we have the stuff that people can actually see, touch, feel, smell, or what have you. And some, depending on the type of museum, we also recreate stuff for you, right? We create experiences. And so the opportunity for museums, and this is a conversation that museum folks and leaders are having with one another around these very same ideas. It's how do we get outside of ourselves? That too often museums have been very cloistered. You come to us, right? Come to us.
Because
right?
we're the experts.
Come to us, right? And what we're trying, many of us are trying to do, I shouldn't say many of us, there are some of us that are working really hard, let's be honest, there's some of us that are working really hard to be in communities and to be active with the school. So we're actually taking the museum and the expertise of the museum into communities so that they can begin reworking what that heritage is. Remember what I said at the beginning, we are providing that forensic, listening to them, giving them opportunities and showing different types of techniques and pedagogy that will help this happen. And so the museum is there to help the teacher. The museum is there for that family visit. The museum is there for that interaction with thing. The museum is there, and we probably can do a much better job than we have in the past to help people understand the process of history. Because that right there is part of the reason why you hear people say, well, when I learned this back in, when I went to school, we didn't talk about that because it wasn't important, and I learned it this way, and I learned it that way, and they're just trying to change it. If you really understood the process of history, things have changed dramatically and continue to do so because we learn new things or new techniques come into play. I mean, I just frankly just think about, at Jamestown, we're going to be hosting Shannon Lanier in a couple of weeks. And Shannon is, professionally, he's in the media, he's a news anchor, journalist, etc. But he is the 6th great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. His family has been telling that story for generations, and he tells this story about being in the 4th grade when they were studying the history, and he tells his teacher, Thomas Jefferson was my great-great, and the teacher called his parents because he was lying in school.
Wow.
And this is something that had been passed in their family for long.
For generations.
Now, mind you, we understand the thorniness of that, but that's their reality. And it took until the late 1990s and DNA to validate that family story. So history, those details, and now it means, whoa, okay, wait a minute. If that happened, then how does that help us rethink Jefferson and his contradictions? Is he any less wonderful? Is he any less intelligent? Is he any what is going on? And so that extra detail now enables us to have those enabled us to have those conversations, right? And so that's the point. Things evolve. Something is found in somebody's attic. Something is found during the archaeology that completely changes our way, but we don't help the public understand that. And that's the one thing that museums can do, because we draw on all of those sources to help guide the public.
But Christy, isn't that revisionism?
Of course it is. That's the very nature of history. That's the very nature of history. It's always as we learn something new. And it's no different than science. They learn something new, You know,
then they
and it changes, and we get new technologies and so forth. So why would we think our history wouldn't be the same?
That's what I would say. I want my doctor
Yeah,
to be a revisionist.
man,
I want to have read the latest thing. Okay.
right.
But I think museums have evolved, and I think back when I was a young person in elementary school and came to Colonial Williamsburg, and relax, Ron, you're going to be okay. Everything was static in that you got to see it, but you did not get to interact and touch it and feel it. And I remember when Colonial Williamsburg started making the decision that with some of their craftsmen, you would go in as a visitor and you could actually maybe touch a wig, or you could touch a clay pipe, or gosh, you go out there now and you can even touch a musket. But then I fast forward and I think about the Yorktown Victory Museum and how that contrasted with my first visit to Jamestown settlement when it was in like that half hangar. And there was no physical interaction on it, but you go through the Yorktown Victory Center, there are holograms there, there are things that you can touch, that you can embrace, and you get almost through osmosis, a sense that you're of that part of history. And I think it is absolutely incredible. And I don't have enough foresight to understand what the next evolution of museums is going to be and how it is going to be interpreted to the next generation of visitors that are coming. But we have come a very, very long way. And I remember when Jamestown and Yorktown, we used to send some of our interpreters out into the public schools, but they took with them all kinds of things that the students could touch, and they'd pass it around the classroom, and they'd go, ooh, ah. And of course, it was something of a marketing situation, but it was also part of an educational opportunity. So,
And we still do that, except now, I shouldn't say except now, we still do that. And what we do with that is more than just about widget making.
Yeah.
Right? It's why did this happen this way? You know, why did they use it? Why did they need it? You know, and having those conversations with kids. You know, the fourth grade, some of you that might remember in the fourth grade, if you're a Virginian, I remember I had, and my daughter did it, and she's 16, making popsicle stick forts.
Oh, yeah.
The Jamestown popsicle stick fort, right? Well, now we're offering an opportunity for students, if the teacher still wants to make the popsicle fort, that's fine. But we're also going to teach you how to make grass Yahankins, right? We're also going to teach you how to weave cloth, an African-style cloth. So the students have an opportunity to do all of these things as an early understanding. And so just figuring out what those pieces are, you know, same experience essentially of going out into the classroom, but as we learn more, what can we do,
what can you do to teach
in
more?
terms of the more?
Ed, how important is language? You talked about back in the 60s, it was a celebration. There was a lot of talk, Tommy, when we were doing 2019, that it was a commemoration. It was not a celebration necessarily. How important is language in the determination of how you commemorate or recognize and remember an event in history?
As they say, you only get one chance to make a first impression, right? How you describe what this is going to either turn off large parts of the audience or intrigue people and want to come in. I don't know that commemoration is the coolest word ever invented. You know, in my friends and colleagues in the museum business to think about this more, you know, we just made a film experience at the American Civil War Museum, you know? It's not just a film, it's an experience, right? So I think that having fresh language that's actually true to what you're doing and maybe set aside. I remember back when I was trying to raise money as a dean and president, there was a chart that you just sort of choose. The campaign for excellence and you can just sort of choose whatever word, you know. And sure enough, you can find that out somewhere. Working in the grain of the story and letting that language emerge from it. I think, you know, the good side, I mean, we've never had as much history as we do now, which is what people don't realize. I mean, it comes at us from so many angles and so many media. students think it's the stuff in that textbook, and I point out, you play video games? Yeah. Okay. Have you seen the movie? And it's all history, but they don't recognize it as history. We need to take things out of the containers. Even ones that commemoration is better than celebration. I bet there's another word.
What's the next word, right?
Yeah.
That's the key. What do you guys think about language? Tommy?
I was just listening to Ed. I had the privilege for 11 years at teaching third-year law students at William and Mary, and I used to tell them two things in the first class. One, to try to get some amusement in their attention. And I said, I don't know anything about ITs. I just learned about goggling yesterday.
Goggling?
and that would tweak their attention right there. But the second
they were
thing,
going, oh Lord.
they were heading for the door. But the second thing that I used to always emphasize in the first class is words mean something. And not just in the practice of law and in academia. Words mean something, and you really need to concentrate on that as part of this curriculum. And I remember the discussion that we had going into 2007. Is it a celebration? Is it a commemoration? Exactly what is it? What is not going to antagonize deliberately a certain segment of our society? Same discussion in 2019. And Ed is much more erudite and an academician than I am, but I am confident you can come up with the appropriate term for 2026. And Cheryl is waiting for you to give her some direction out there.
Thanks.
Anything else I can do for you, Ed?
I don't know what the word is, but picking up on Christy's theme from before, it has to be an exploration.
Absolutely.
And it has to be, as you were saying, Tommy, everybody who comes to it needs to find their own way into this. So you need to make it capacious and rich enough that there are multiple things to discover, right? Memory is a word, but commemoration sounds like a thing, right? rather than an adventure, a process. And I think we've moved beyond sort of holding the past up as a static thing to, okay, that's what that is. That's what I'm going to remember. Because you never can tell when you're making a memory, right? And I would say, take advantage of stuff. Take advantage of revisionism of the things that we've learned. We're going to have to be brave about this. You're talking about not alienating people. Beginning with sensitivity is a good way of doing this. On the other hand, the flip side of that is how do we engage more people? How do we make them care? Alienating people is one thing, but making them care about it is another.
It's a whole different
Well, I mean, I think that ultimately is part of the opportunity here, right? We talked about how different things are since we pulled off the miraculous in 2015, because that was miraculous, right? And somewhere along the way, our sense of empathy has diminished collectively. And so when we figure out how to take a moment to even consider someone else, when we take a moment to open ourselves up and be compassionate for just a moment, that to me is the window. That to me is the opportunity to get in and have those moments. Because people, what I see all the time is that when people are in a group or they think that they've got a group backing them up, they get real bold and really outrageous. But when you have people having one-on-one interactions with something, they take that moment. They may walk away and still jump back into their bubble, but in that moment, and I watch visitors literally every day. I watch what they're doing and what they're saying and how they're being. And I have no idea who they were when they walked in my door, outside of what the stats tell me in terms of their age, their ethnicity, or where they're from, or whatever, right? But the people that I watch interacting with my staff or going to their car and they're talking to their family members or they're talking with other guests that they're passing on the sidewalk, those moments are if we're able to create those moments, you're more likely to have somebody step back and actually embrace a different story or a different way of thinking about something. And I know this because I've done it with individuals more recently who, you know, have a very rigid idea about what they think ought to be happening with history, and history is, you know, this idea of history being static, and, you know, I actually had somebody tell me, "You're just trying to erase white history." I'm like, "No, I'm not." What in the hell? Right? It's like, wow, but it's part of the mantra, right? It's part of this environment that we find ourselves in, and so in that moment, it's really easy to get mad and say, "Well, this is what happened to my people," or "That's what happened to." But instead, to take that step back and say, "Let me show you what I mean." And take them through and pull them out of that place back into the humanity, right? That's the remarkable thing, and that's one of the things that makes me so. That's one of the things that makes me so hopeful about the America 250. Not because it was perfect and it was, you know, the greatest country ever made. What is so remarkable about the American Revolution, and specifically the Declaration of Independence, and if you haven't read it all the way through, you would probably get mad, because there's some pretty really horrible language in parts of it, right? But here's the thing. That document gave every person, regardless of ethnicity or gender, or however they choose to identify, the language to demand their place as an American. And that is powerful. And if we fail to bring that to fruition in whatever this programmatic thing is that we do, then we have failed. Because that is ultimately it. That is what is guiding, you know, so many people to push America to be better at each level of expansion of rights. Who's an American, when they're American. I mean, at every level, it is those words, we hold these truths, right? That's what guides the expansion of this nation's ideologies for the next 250 years.
So how do you, in any of the commemorations that you all discussed, what do you do when the academicians, when the historians don't agree?
When they don't agree?
When they don't agree.
I can't imagine such a situation.
How do you decide which one gets to be the ultimate?
You only ask one historian.
That's
Now
one
you're
way.
in trouble, right? This one.
You know, I don't think. I mean, we disagree for a living.
Right.
It's kind of if you don't agree with me, I'll. No. And so I don't really see that very much.
So you don't see that as an issue?
Because ultimately, to use Christy's language, we're forensic. What does the evidence say, right? Now, the difference is going to be not who's right and wrong, but how do you frame the story? It strikes me that where this story that we're talking about right now begins and ends seems problematic to me. You know, I mean, just intrinsically, not anybody's fault, but when do you pick it up and how far does it go? I think that would be where you would find historians saying, well, if you wait till that point to begin, you've already foreclosed all these kinds of things, especially if we think about, you know, the indigenous history. You need a lot longer running start than 1775, right? So I think that, you know, the disagreements will work themselves out, but somebody has to decide what's the frame we can do. You know, if I can just kind of put in a point with this, Colonial Williamsburg has such an advantage in this because they invented the machine that actually accomplishes what Christy's talking about, which is living interpreters. And Christy was one and a pioneer in all this. And that these one-to-one conversations can do things that you can't do with any spectacle, no matter how big it is. Back to the commemoration, Christy and I served on the Monument Avenue Commission in Richmond and had a bazillion conversations with people with different opinions about all this. We talk about.
I'm quite sure.
But you can see how. So people would come up and they would say, "But Stonewall Jackson was a fine man. He taught these children in slavery how to read in Sunday school." And I just said one time, "But what if he'd won?" And you can see it just never occurred to them that the question wasn't how good a person was Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, but what were they fighting for, and if they'd actually accomplished this. You're in favor of dismantling the United States and having perpetual bondage, and but it's the story you begin with that determines a lot of what you're going to argue about. But I'd also say the goal shouldn't be to remove points of dissension and difference. We should build it in, and historians are good at that. So I think that recognizing that conflict of perspective is intrinsic to the enterprise. It's not to find a common denominator, it's to find common ground where you can actually exchange perspectives, whether they're yours of your own ethnicity or gender or whatever, but that you can imagine what it would have been like to have been here and had your ancestral land taken away, or what it would have been like to be dragged off a ship. You know, people have to try, even though it's impossible.
Right.
It's the effort itself is, builds humility, which I think is a main thing that a lot of this story has to be about, is not the chest thumping of what a great country we've turned out to be, but how unlikely it was that this worked out. And what were the costs when this nation was created and did sustain slavery for another 2 centuries? That's, that has to be hardwired into the story from the beginning. It can't just be, oh, and by the way, it became the largest slave empire in the modern world. The question has to be at the beginning, how did this happen that these issues, the Declaration, could eventuate in such a place?
And mind you, we're having all of these conversations about what we're going to do in academia and what we're going to do at our museums and all that. Bottom line is, only 36% of the general public will come to any of these places, and only 6% will read one of y'all's books. So here's the thing. We've got to find other medium to make this work, because you know where 68% of Americans get their history from?
The internet.
Movies and TV. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to partner and really understand the importance of dramatic art and all of that, to find ways to partner with those creatives that are making that thing, that are telling those stories, because that's what's going to stick in the head. And so,
So
last question before we go to our audience questions. So get ready, audience.
Comment on that, because I think one of the challenges is, and going back to Ed's observations about public education, is the de-emphasizing of history within the curriculums, whether it is elementary, middle school, or high school. And I think it makes it that much more challenging to deliver the message, whether it's through academia, whether it's through books, whether it's through museums. Whatever that interpretive means is, it's gotten much more challenging, because you've got a generation coming along that doesn't even have a fundamental knowledge of some of the aspects of history, even if some of that understanding is erroneous.
And we don't, because we decided, or someone decided, that it was more valuable to invest in STEM, that was the future. So the balance of that, we've lost about 20 years. Not that that's bad, but that was given up in favor of solid civic education.
So since each of you have been involved in a commemoration, for 2026, answer this question. Make sure you remember to what?
Tell the truth.
Okay.
Involve as many as possible.
Tommy?
do a very detailed and comprehensive preparation in an effort to deliver your message so that there's a public reception to it. You cannot do it spontaneously, and you cannot do it in a compressed period.
Okay. Questions from the audience? There's a hand raised right there. The young lady with the glasses? Yes, yes, ma'am. With the mic, waiting for the mic to come over.
Hello, I'm Liz Covart, your friend from Massachusetts. Hi, my Virginia friends. It does strike me you're all from Virginia. And so there's a couple questions I have. One, what do you think from the commemoration experiences you've had in Virginia that each of us can take home to Massachusetts, to California, to Wyoming, to make, when we're thinking about commemorations, are there lessons that we can take back and share with our community partners? And second, place was a big theme of your answers without being, a direct theme of your answers. And I'm curious about Ed's question about how do you get people to care? And in my experience in public and scholarly history, place plays a big role. People who come to Boston and walk the Freedom Trail, they get to feel a part of the sites. But what do you do, east of Eastern Illinois, where there aren't Revolutionary War battlefields or other places that are really connected with the revolution? Are documents the answer to how you get people to care, and the language and the ideas? Or how do you give people the same sense of belonging, since we're such a big country, and the sites of this event and the places don't extend that far west?
Okay.
Great question.
Yeah.
The booster in me wants to say, come to Virginia. But that's not my job, so I won't say that. It's a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a wonderful question, and I recall during the 2007 commemoration and the 2019 commemoration, we talk about, and Christy, mentioned about the Spanish, the Dutch, the Norse. Well, of course, Jamestown was the first English-speaking permanent colony in these United States. But the importance of it, if you look where the significant developments and the expansion of civilization took place in what we now know as the United States, it really started on the East Coast, and it moved its way gradually west. And I remember the discussions that we had about well, there were a lot of misconceptions about whether or not the Pilgrims got here before they did at Jamestown settlement. And of course, little research would say, I can't remember whether it was 12 or 16 years that they settled Jamestown before the Pilgrims set foot on that mysterious rock. But I think one of the thoughts I've had is that you have got to promote and transport that message that while the founding of America may have started to populate itself on the East Coast, that it ultimately had a series of waves that went out to Chicago, that ultimately went out to California, even though Virginia actually, I think, went all the way to California at one point. But I was just glad we gave part of it to West Virginia, but that's another story.
Ed?
Our friend Karen Wolf, many of you know, at Omohundro, spoke about a vast history, a vaster America. If we think that the story is not just about the seed that was planted that grew into the United States, but rather the consequences of the United States establishing dominion across North America, then it's a different story. And you think about what was happening in California at the beginning. And it was a far more global story than you might think, the way that it's taught even in Virginia, or maybe even Massachusetts, that some way that you can just sort of surprise people right off the bat is talk about all the networks. So think about how far radiated the connections of this work across the Atlantic, into Africa, across the continent, into all these indigenous folks, into the Caribbean, into what's Canada. I think from the beginning, if you think of this as a node that connects with all these other places, then people can feel a part of the story. But what that means is, Liz, I think it's a great point, is you begin it as the problem to be solved. You have visitors come here and say, here you are, and you can see the blacksmith shop. But let's think about this. How far does this story matter? What were the consequences? Who shaped it along the way? So I think that's an opportunity that we have from things that we've learned over the last 20 years about how to do this, is that power resides in place, and that's why museums are especially important, but it's not confined to that place. So that's what I would say.
And she also asked about what lessons could she take back to Massachusetts, back to where she is in terms of developing commemorations.
We've already mentioned that Thanksgiving thing, right? We've already got that worked out.
Any lessons that you all could share with her?
You know, my thinking about it is, even in the planning stages, it becomes extremely important to include as many voices and then get away from the idea of control, of what that looks like, right? Bring as many people to the table as you can to have that conversation, and they can't always be the usual suspects. We do that a lot, especially with communities of color. It's like, there's that minister you got to talk to, or there's that person you got. You know, open it up and see what happens. There is a movement of young people right now that are engaged and want to do this stuff, but they may not have that pedigree yet, but they got the work and they got some incredible thought processes about how they want to see this. Because this is also for them, right? So that's just among some of the things that I think about with regard to your question. And yeah, I mean, if you're in the Dakotas or you're down in Arizona, it is a different story. And I think Ed is right on the money that those stories are important too. Because it doesn't matter that the English-speaking and eventually United States spreads a consciousness. They're not spreading into nothing. There are people there. There are other communities and civilizations there. You know, I tell people all the time, you know, we talk about the southern border and Mexicans. Dude, the U.S. crossed their border a couple times, right? And and that there are people that are in, you know, southwestern. So our U.S. expansion, I was just reading an amazing thing, a paper about this recently, about this, the idea that the expansion of the U.S. as a westward expansion is really inaccurate, because it was actually doing this.
Yeah, it was.
Right? And so, you know, from 1848, you know, and beyond, I mean, so there's a lot there, and you still have power of place, because we don't sound like Brits. You know, our language is infused with indigenous language and African foods and cultural, you know, pieces. And so, I mean, we are Americans because of all of this.
Anything you want to add, Tommy, before we go to our next question?
I think enough has been said on that topic.
Another question from the audience? Yes, the lady right there.
Good evening. I'm actually a middle school educator from North Carolina, and I wanted to mention that I brought a group of students up here to Historic Triangle last spring, and we had an absolutely phenomenal experience with the museums and with Colonial Williamsburg, and brought back...
Did you come to Jamestown?
Yes, we did. Jamestown-Yorktown. We did it all. We were here for a week. Yeah, Jamestown-Yorktown actually was really incredible, and so thank you for your work on that, and it is making a difference, and the young people are paying attention, and I do have a lot of hope for the future based on their understandings. But my question is, I'm really interested in the power of public ritual and ceremony and gesture. And what I was wondering is, with the 250th coming up, if time and money and consensus were of no object, what do you, I know, in a magical world, what do you think would be the most weighty and meaningful and non-patronizing and non-reductive gesture of sort of spiritual and emotional reparation towards the Black and Indigenous communities in this country? I'm just fascinated to think about what would be, you know, if you could do anything, what would be a gesture that would be meaningful? So,
okay.
Thank you.
Who wants to take that one on?
Well, I think first of all, you got to get away from the idea of thinking there's a singular indigenous or black community.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, right? Because there's going to be different reactions to that question. There's some people that don't feel like any kind of reparative behavior is required, right? And then there are others who are going to, you know. So but I do think, I do think that it isn't, what people want more than anything else isn't a gesture. They want an authentic engagement, and they want empathy. And so if you could give anything, give that first. And how does that show up? It can show up in a variety of ways, but it shows up individually. So maybe it's about us thinking about the community ritual a little differently, a little bit differently. You know, whether that is something as, you know, oh God, I can hear the, whoo, I'm not gonna say it. I was just saying maybe it means we don't sing the Star Spangled Banner, understanding its history, but we sing God, you know, Bless America as the national anthem or something, or because of it's less problematic, right? Or maybe it's, I mean, I don't know. But the bottom line is I do think that it has to be whatever the thing is, whatever the engagement is, it can't be performative. We've had enough of that.
Okay, another question.
There was
from
a
the
hand
audience.
over here.
Oh, did I miss?
Yeah, right there.
Yes. Could you take the mic, ma'am, so we can hear you?
Hi.
Thank you. Hold it up.
Sorry. Hold on. I just shut my book. So there were a couple of good quotes that I think you all have probably pretty set your path on finding the solution for what you're looking for. And Ed said, the goal shouldn't be removing points of dissension or conflict, not to find a common denominator, but common ground. And that's what I think people have been asking here, and I think in the various different ways that you all have addressed the questions, you're doing that here. The bigger question is, how do you broaden that reach? It's been very enlightening to listen to you talk, and those quotes are the ones that have stood out of this entire thing for me.
Okay, thank you. How do you broaden it out? How do you make what we've talked about tonight more accessible to everyone?
As I listen to us, I hear us confronting an issue of how do you scale up a powerful individual experience into a collective experience. I hear what you're saying about ritual. I was just at a talk not before last and heard somebody do what could be a rote acknowledgement of being on the land of the Monacan people. And then also thanking and acknowledging that the buildings that we were in, this is the University of Virginia, were built by enslaved people. And it's like, that was written down, but it's good to remember that. How do you take the experience of these individual conversations that we were just talking about that can change people's minds and scale it? I do believe that we have this internet thing that could go along. You goggle, I understand.
Goggling's important.
I think that there are possibilities for right now. We're being streamed. Possibilities for extension that we haven't really incorporated. We're still dividing things into sort of theaters. And there could be, you know, the filmic qualities that you're talking about, Christy, but also interactive, so that people don't just watch something and take it or not. How would you extend it? So I think we should use this opportunity to think about how do we amplify and multiply these points of intersection as a part of the very fabric of what we're doing, recognizing that a spectacle of 500 people is cool, a single conversation is cool, but there's really no more place more powerful than a 14-person classroom or a 25-person classroom to make memories. We already have this network created. It's called the Schools of America. working in those places where we have trusted allies as teachers is a way to be able to say, okay, look, here's this encounter in the time of the Revolution, and these interpreters portrayed it this way. Now, let's think about why did they do that and what's revealed and hidden in the way that they did that. And then maybe have a chance to talk to those interpreters. So I think we can scale things up beyond ways that we never could before. So that would be my hope, is that we can take advantage of the most profound social change of our time is the proliferation of this digital media. Surely we can think of some way to use it for good.
Mm-hmm. Tommy?
As I've listened to the conversation tonight, it was like a flashback to the 2007 preparation. You know, there is no shortage of historical material around which to construct a commemoration, a celebration, a memory, whatever you want to do it. One of the real challenges that I recall is trying to distill it down and to come up with a curriculum that you focus your commemoration, your memorial, your celebration on, because you can find there's so much information it begins to diffuse what you are trying to do, and that brings about some decision making, some very hard decisions on, you know, identifying what audience are we trying to reach in this commemoration. What are the primary messages that we want to focus on, because we cannot address every ancillary consideration that may be of historical significance. And that distilling and analytical process in itself generates some tensions, because you've got to develop a consensus on this is what we are going to focus on. These may be our 4 objectives that we're going to go forward on. How you initiate and implement those 4 objectives is a totally different thing, but trying to manage the enormity of the opportunities that exist within the historical context can be challenging.
Well, and that also takes it back then to a point that Christy made earlier, which is you have to open up that decision-making body so that you have different perspectives. Would you not agree?
And it's multiple partners.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's the partnerships, because, you know, the partners can actually help make some of that come to pass. So,
And
a
the
variety
key
of
partners, to reiterate a point, there's nobody who knows those kids in the classroom like the teacher. So rather than thinking about coming up with a perfect curriculum, think about framing things enough that there's room in that classroom for the teacher, expert, committed to these students, to select from that. Here's what we need to know, because the past is too expansive to wrap our minds around. But for right now, in this 4th grade classroom, this 7th grade classroom, or this AP class, here's the things that in the spirit of what we've been talking about. So I think that we already have a distributed network of thousands of teachers who will have it as their responsibility to think about all this. So I would think you present them a toolkit that they can choose from it what they know best would work with their own students, would be my suggestion.
You know, it's interesting. You all talk a lot about the students, and I agree, because I think that's how we keep history going forward and so forth. But I also worry about the adults, because a lot of times the students can hear one thing in the classroom, but then they go home and there's another story being told. And I'm not trying to solve the problems of the world this evening, but my point being, how do we also engage our adult population? You know, this place should be packed, but this is not necessarily top of mind. So what do we do? How do we make it top of mind? I know. I think we have time for one more question, because we're almost at the end. Yes, ma'am.
Ron standing over
Yes,
there.
because Ron's standing over here in the corner, which means we gotta go. Yes, with the mask, right. Is there a mic? Here she comes.
Hi, and thank you. This builds somewhat on your comment. I deal with a lot of college sophomores and in a history adjacent discipline. And I made the mistake of one time asking my students to write a reflective essay on their experience studying history. And the two most common themes that I got were that history is something that is just that elite people use to quiz each other on to feel smart about themselves and try to feel superior to other people. And then the other thing was that studying history is hopeless, because the point of learning history is to learn from the mistakes of the past so that you don't repeat them. And that the country has done a terrible job with this. So history adjacent fields are useless, and they really don't find much room for hope, and they certainly don't want, don't necessarily, it's easier in some ways to check it off and not have to engage than to think that no, there really is some hope here for us. So looking at what you're talking about with the 250 commemorations, or whatever they end up being called, what sort of questions or starting points or frames of honest hopefulness would you like to see conveyed to a generation or generations that have been burned out by STEM-centric education, by the pandemic, and by a variety of other social factors?
In other words, how do you get them re-engaged in history?
And
hope,
and in a hopeful fashion too. That this is not just a sort of exercise in, okay, well, finally I know more, but this actually has some meaning both individually and collectively.
Okay. Who wants to start? Ed.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Christy, in her comments about, and to anchor this in the commemoration we're actually talking about, the Declaration of Independence, whatever the elites intended those words to mean, and whatever consequence they had, people who were excluded from that has seized it as their script. We are created equal. We will have these rights. So I think that to make this worthwhile for CW to actually think about it in concrete ways, you're building in the fact that it's dissension from the beginning, that people from the moment those words were written were saying, I don't care how you meant those. This is what they say. And I'm going to act on my equality. I'm going to enact my equality. So if we're looking for a moment of hopefulness, that is the script that people have taken for themselves to create a more hopeful future. So I'm just piggybacking on what Christy had said before.
Christy, you want to add to that?
Nope.
Okay. Tommy, you want to add to that?
I think the professor did an extraordinary job.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, Ed Ayers, Christy Coleman, Tommy Norment.
Thank you, panel and moderator, for a spectacular evening. The good news is that there's a wonderful reception upstairs in Dominion Energy Hall, and I think that all of our panelists and our moderator will be there, and we can continue this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, audience.